There are many fears around lifting weights for young people, and they should have to wait till 16 or 18 until they pick anything up. Stunt undergrowth, injuries, sore lower backs, getting too big or getting too slow are often seen as the main fears. And that's just in males. There are even more concerns and fears around lifting weights in females. This video is going to look at 6 of the most common myths and beliefs around resistance training in adolescents and show the real truth behind what's safe and effective. These myths are largely taken from this paper by MacMillan 2024. A lot of the guidance throughout the video comes from various works by Avery Faigenbaum, Lloyd's Youth Physical Development Model, and some recent research by Stricker et al. 2020. Let's take a look first at some of the traditional exercises that are performed in the gym and how they may relate to general day-to-day tasks and some of the activities or movements we perform on a pitch. One such example would be a block start in athletics, and that's really similar to pushing a prowler or any kind of weight, but also looking at flexion around the knee and around the hip. In terms of day-to-day movement, we'd also see that if someone was pushing a lawnmower around. While more common in rugby, is often used in Gaelic football and the odd time in hurling as well, a handoff is really similar to a push-up or any of the main pressing movements done with a dumbbell or a barbell. If we think a lot of the main pulling movements or rows or pull-ups, they're really similar to when we use climb a tree or any other main pulling movement that we use our shoulder and arm for. Another I'm always really wary of is when we see some young, small children carrying around these really heavy school bags and just carrying around day to day places a lot of stress on their body that who knows if they're actually capable to cope with, and the excess stress that puts on their backs. But I also think if they have to walk up the stairs to upstairs classrooms or canteens. No one tends to become overly concerned about this, but if you ever do any kind of step up or squat, even with a small weight, people become really concerned. Myth number 1 is that youth strength training stunts growth. But does it actually? Will lifting weights ruin young people's growth plates? Or in fact, is the opposite the case, does it actually promote and help growth? The research has shown there's actually no negative effects from any kind of resistance training, and that's before, during or after the growth spurt that tends to occur somewhere between 12 and 14 for boys and a little earlier for females. To give a quote from the paper, there's no evidence to suggest that resistance training will negatively impact growth and maturation during childhood and adolescence. And that comes from Faigenbaum et al. In 2009. In fact, the opposite is often the case. Lifting weights can actually help promote growth or provide more support for bones, especially for the muscles around them as they get longer. Think of growing pains or all the really tight tendon areas that adolescents tend to have. Doing some form of resistance training will help the muscles adapt alongside all the growth that's happened to their bones. To give a second quote from the paper, in fact, engaging in resistance training during childhood and adolescence can promote optimal bone development and enhance overall physical health. Big issue we see in some sports where they don't actually do any heavy loading, such as in cycling, is that their bones really struggle to cope with the demands of everyday life placed upon them, and they tend to be really weak. Some form of resistance training helps to support both bone density and development of quality muscle mass. I think a lot of the viewpoints here come from seeing small powerlifters, bodybuilders or weightlifters. Despite they've been lifting weights since they've been quite young, hence why they're so good at it now, it's not that the lifting of weights has kept them small. They're just far more likely to be really good at it because they're small. A shorter body, a shorter leg, a shorter arm, just shorter levers in general, make it much easier to lift way heavier weights from the ground to hip height or to get them all the way over your head, such as in the snatch and clean and jerk in Olympic weightlifting. Also in terms of bodybuilding, the same amount of muscle mass on a longer limb versus on a shorter limb will look like it's way more muscle. Again, hence why shorter people tend to look like much better bodybuilders despite having very similar levels of muscle mass as someone who's taller. This isn't a case that all the lifting weights has made them short. They're just risen to the top of their sport that's very much resistance training dominant because they're so small. Myth number 2, youth strength training is unsafe. But is it? Let's look at some of the numbers here to see if that actually stacks up. Realistically, walk into a gym at 13, 14, 15 years of age and lifting weights properly, and with the emphasis on properly here, is far more safe than going out in a field with a bunch of other 13-year-olds you've potentially never met before, all of whom are wielding sticks. But that's what hurling is. Now I do understand there's an element of accepted risk that you take on board when you enter on the field of any contact sport. You accept the fact there is a likelihood of injury here through contact, through twisting, through turning, or any of the factors just cause you to make a decision while moving at high speed, allowing for contact and the fact that there are other implements used, such as the ball and notably the hurdles. That being said, when studied, injury rates in gyms are so much lower it's actually hard to describe how much lower they are and to give an example of that in terms of numbers. And the few injuries that do occur generally happen for people doing silly things, such as lifting weights they're not remotely capable of, or using machinery or equipment completely incorrectly. In terms of common injuries from playing hurling and football, they tend to come from either overuse or collisions. Now in some respect, we can impact the collision-based stuff because we're providing greater support around the joints that tend to receive the greatest impact when those collisions occur, such as around the shoulder area. Stronger muscles in the shoulder, the chest and the back can keep that a little bit more stable when a collision does occur. An awful lot of other injuries tend to happen from overuse or from muscles being weak, too much excess stress being placed upon them. The most common being hamstrings and groins. We can reduce the impact of some of that overuse by just making those muscles stronger in general. If they're stronger, they're able to cope with the demands placed on them even more, despite some levels of overuse being there. If we think of a tight hamstring, a hamstring doesn't generally get tight from lack of stretching. It gets tight because it's weak and it's overused, and it tightens up to stop it being used anymore and try and reduce the overall amount of activity being done. A stronger hamstring can cope with those loads even better, reduce the chance of it being injured, and lead to higher outputs from the strength training that has been done. Also, with some of the potential non-contact injuries, strength training can provide a lot of stability around the ankle, knee and hip, particularly in females who tend to be more susceptible to non-contact knee injuries. It is worth noting though, and I emphasise this at the start, that all these movements should be done correctly, and that's why it's worth having some form of supervision from a qualified coach who can teach the exercise properly, give you a well thought out programme, and ensure you're progressively overloading week on week in a safe and effective manner without trying to do too much too early. Myth number 3. Youth should only focus on cardiovascular exercise. What should adolescents actually focus on at specific ages? Lloyd's youth physical development model has highlighted specific aspects of fitness at different ages, and you'll see that on screen here now. I'm showing the male version here just because it fits on the screen a little bit better. The female one is actually quite similar, just with slight differences in terms of age. You'll see the cardiovascular development or aerobic development is important at most ages, but so is strength. It's just delivered in a different way than we automatically expect, other than traditional resistance exercises where you go to the gym. You'll note as well that power, coordination, flexibility are also highlighted as really important. All of these can be developed through well-designed resistance training programs. How we develop this strength and power though changes a lot based on the age. We don't really bring 8, 9 or 10 year olds into a gym and do your traditional barbell exercises like squats, bench pressing and rows. Before they go through the growth spurt or through childhood in general, they don't develop strength in the same way. It's more neurological than morphological. They also generally wouldn't have the emotional or psychological maturity to go into a gym, take on the specific instructions there, and maybe have the patience to take proper rest times, to wait before they add load, and to just generally perform the exercise correctly in a safe manner with others around them. Also, gyms are generally adult-dominated environments and possibly aren't the best place for younger children to be in. But from 12 or 13 onwards, we can develop strength through the traditional resistance exercises. That's alongside hopping, sprinting, jumping and throwing, and they can both benefit each other and complement each other in a well-designed training program that should also include the sport at the centre of it. Resistance training among youth aged 6 to 18 years elicits improvements in muscular strength, power, running speed, kicking velocity, endurance, dynamic balance, flexibility and general motor performance. And that's from Grenache et al. 2016. Think of a 13 or 14 year old do any form of aerobic test or giving a measure of aerobic performance, such as doing a beep test, a yo-yo test, a time trial, or even running a cross-country race. Record their time and let them keep on top of whatever normal training they're doing. Let it be specific GA training, they might do some athletics or cross-country training, but also include some resistance training as part of their overall routine. Within reason, so it's not too much overall load. You can be pretty sure 6 to 8 weeks later, whatever aerobic performance they did will have improved, largely because that strength training will support all of the aerobic training or development that they have. That's going to be down to improvements in strength, speed, coordination, posture, and just general economy as they move. Myth number 4, strength training leads to bulky muscles. There's plenty of people who've been doing resistance training for a long period of time and wish that was the case. They've put so much time and effort into trying to put on lean mass, and yet they really struggle. When was the last time you've seen a 14-year-old that was too big in terms of pure muscle mass? Let's think of some of the sports that develop some of the strongest athletes, particularly as youths. Gymnastics, dancing and sprinting, particularly Irish dancing. None of those are big and bulky, but they've really strong legs and shoulders, depending specifically on the sport. Stronger doesn't have to mean bigger, and it rarely does. We only get bigger if we eat more calories than we're burning off day to day. Most teenagers are so active, they really struggle to get in enough calories in general, and if they add resistance training on top of all the activity they're doing, then that's even more that they need to try and consume. So to think they're going to put on weight from this, it's actually often the opposite case. Also, as they get stronger from resistance training, they're more likely to burn up even more calories in the training they're already doing, such as their GA and running stuff, because their outputs are just going to be higher from being stronger and more powerful. To link it back to the bodybuilders and powerlifters we mentioned earlier, while some of those are really big, and again, this is often because they're that little bit shorter in stature, they've also been lifting for decades, not for years. We might see some examples of athletes a little bit too big too quickly, but that's rarely from purely resistance training alone. They've often put on far more than just muscle mass. they've often put on not lean weight or fat mass as well. And that's just from eating too much over a shorter period, and usually during stages where they've reduced overall activity and often dropped an awful lot of aerobic training. While traditional bodybuilding regimens focus primarily on muscle size, there are training programs designed to prioritise neural adaptations over hypertrophy. These programs are particularly ideal in competitive settings where strength-weight ratio significantly affects performance outcomes. Think again of some really strong athletes who have to meet specific weight standards. Jockeys, boxers, wrestlers, powerlifters, weightlifters. If you go down through the weight classes, you'll see some who are quite small but are really, really strong. They can manage all this alongside some resistance training just by keeping on top of what they eat. And realistically, the opposite is the case for the majority of teenagers who just don't get enough fuel on board to drive and recover from the majority training and activity they're already doing. Myth number 5, youth strength training hinders flexibility. Well, what if resistance training was actually key to improving your flexibility, not taken away from it? Flexibility is the range of motion we have around a joint or a series of joints. The ability to go through a larger range of motion comes from being stronger throughout that range and from being balanced strength-wise in the muscles around that particular joint. Think, for example, your shoulders. If you just focus purely on chest or pec development, you might lose flexibility there, particularly if you neglect some of the muscles in your back. But if you keep things balanced there, then you're far more likely to maintain all the shoulder flexibility you had. To give another example of hamstrings, if you just look at the exercise being performed here, you'll see I'm going through full range of motion in a loaded pattern. The strength that's developed at the end range of that motion is going to give me flexibility or mobility that I can use. It's not coming from purely stretching, because if you were to just do a load of stretching and then go out and do activity on it, it'd immediately tighten up if it feels weak in that specific position. If I hadn't done any of that exercise for a period of time, then the next day I'd be sore, stiff, feeling tight, and wouldn't be able to get to that end range. That's what some people mistake for losing flexibility when they do forms of strength or resistance training. It's not that you've actually lost the flexibility from doing the strength training, it's just tighter the next day because it's adapting to the demands or stresses that have been placed on it. If you're consistently lifting, working through range of motion, through adequate external load, then not only will you keep the flexibility you have, but you should also develop it even further as you become stronger at the different ranges. Muscles will often tighten up if they're weak and overused. For example, think going out and doing a mad sprinting session with huge volume. The next day, your hamstrings and probably an awful lot of your muscles will be tight and sore. That's because they're not used to the demands that have been placed on it. If you progressively build them up to that load and support that with a lot of strength training, then they're less likely to be sore, stiff and tighten after any exercise or training session that you load it with. If you haven't done any type of training session, then the next day you're going to be sore, stiff and tired. But if you're training consistently and you don't do any big jumps in the overall intensity or amount of training you do, then you're less likely to have that feeling. It's just a new stimulus you're not used to, and it's your body's way of saying, oh, let me cope with this, instead of let you jump straight back into more. You're not losing flexibility from doing resistance training. Strength training exercises that involve full range of motion movements and dynamic stretching can enhance flexibility while also promoting muscular strength and endurance. That's from Zawalski et al. 2017. Our final myth, strength training will delay skill development. If done correctly, focus on fundamental movement skills will develop the skill and strength in young people. Now, while not specifically aimed at teenagers, these are more aimed at ages 5 to 10, but there is room for improvement throughout the teenage years as well. Again, just showing Lloyd's YPD model here again, you can see how big, bold and important the FMS is. And this stands for fundamental movement skills, not some form of movement screen. Fundamental movement skills are running, jumping, throwing, catching, hopping, skipping and bounding alongside a few more. If done in a somewhat unstructured manner, through a variety of games, obstacle courses and other fun activities, then these will lead to strength developments or benefits in children instead of the traditional resistance exercise we associate getting stronger. During childhood, or up to around age 12, children develop strength neurologically. That means all the jumping, hopping, landing, balancing they do will lead to far greater strength benefits than the traditional resistance exercise we think of when we think of strength training, like squats, presses, pull-ups, anything like that. These resistance exercises will be beneficial in the teenage years, but they should develop a foundation of strength through more fundamental movement skill based stuff during childhood. And these can be done running around playing the majority of games they play, but with more of a fundamentals approach than a GAA sport specific approach. Again, think of some of the strongest children who are developed through their sport: gymnasts, Irish dancers and sprinters or jumpers in athletics. The majority of their strength is developed through hops, jumps and isometric holds. In terms of teenagers trying to develop skills, strength training will actually benefit their development of skills through greater coordination and force production. Think of striking a ball in hurling or kicking a ball in football. Being stronger alongside developing the skill will lead to the ball going further in both. Plus, any potential imbalances they may have left v right will hopefully be reduced through proper strength training that focus on both unilateral and bilateral movements. Integrating strength training with other physical activities and skill building exercises can actually enhance overall motor performance and skill acquisition. It should be re-emphasised here that everything we've said about safety is provided the adolescents themselves are doing the exercise in a safe and progressive manner, and have had the technique of each exercise taught them correctly and have some form of monitoring in place to ensure they're getting feedback around how to perform each exercise, but also that they're loading in a safe and progressive manner within their capabilities. If you want to get your youth athlete started, then download the cheat sheet below and have a look at this video up here for more information in a similar area.